Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
I will be the greatest president that God ever created.
That's my Donald Trump talking pen, just playing to you, Ben.
I'm not sure if he was the greatest president ever created.
Rows with the European Union over vaccine supplies. MPs demanding more clarity on schools. And talk of a possible second divorce, Scotland style. And we're still only in January. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. We have a beautiful blend of guests for you on this week's show, including the Telegraph's outgoing US editor, Ben Riley-Smith, on 3 years of covering the Trump circus, and former BBC Newsnight presenter Gavin Esler on whether the union is on the brink of breakup, and whether the key to that is English nationalism. But first, like me, if you're a parent, you've been seeing a lot more of your children over the past year, which has its ups and downs as we row about the remote control or who makes cups of tea. So, like millions of parents, I was somewhat engaged by reports over the weekend that schools might not fully reopen until after the Easter holidays. Now, Easter is April the 4th, to save you looking it up in your diary. It caused quite the reaction from parents and MPs alike. And for once, Labour and Tory MPs were united on really being critical of a government policy. The chairman of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon MP, a Tory MP, called for the government to be clearer on what was required for pupils to get back into classrooms. But the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said simply that he would update parents and teachers as soon as we can. And we've heard that before, haven't we, listeners? But first up on this podcast, the educational commentator and head teacher of the Michaela Community School in Wembley, Katharine Birbalsingh, about what it's like to be dealing with this ever-shifting timetable, and that's not in the classroom. Katharine Birbalsingh, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Now, please tell us about your school.
Well, Michaela is a free school that opened in 2014. We're in Wembley, so in the inner city in London, and we're quite traditional. So we believe in, excellent discipline, keeping standards high, and we also teach gratitude and kindness. But I think that's not so much traditional. It's just more us. It's the inner city, so we've got a variety of different children, all different backgrounds, and there are about 800 children in the school, and it goes from year 7 through to year 13.
How are they? How are they coping with this difficult time?
Yeah, so it's hard on everyone, and particularly hard on parents, I think, because our parents don't necessarily know how to support their children at home with their learning. We've been doing live lessons and then getting work through Google Classroom, which sort of works. And I say sort of works because we found that when we did this last lockdown, that when the children returned to us in June, so those were the exam classes that returned, we found that they really didn't remember that much of what they'd been taught online. And I know that this is our only choice at the moment, so we have to do it online. Parents look at them and they say, well, look, they're looking at the screen, the teacher is talking, it's just like being in a classroom. It really isn't. In order for learning to take place, the children need to feel like the teacher is going to hold them to account in the classroom. And the way in which a teacher does that is that they're constantly peppering them with questions. And the child never knows when the question is coming to them. And that cannot be done online. It's just impossible because you're unmuting, muting, so on. Many of the classes online, you're not even able to have their videos on, and you can't have their videos on necessarily depending on how naughty your children are and what your intake is like. So you may not even be able to see the kids. And, I speak to teachers, not at our school, but at other schools where they might have maybe 100 kids on their Zoom class. And the reason why they've got that is because the schools are also partly open for the disadvantaged children. So they've got 100 kids in their class. They can't possibly be asking questions of 100 kids. And then at the end of the lesson, when they finish and they say, you can log off now, well, all those little black squares, a number of them don't log off. And the reason why they don't is because they're not even sat in front of the computer, right? Ugh. So there's that, them just not being there. But then even if they are there, the teacher isn't able to check for understanding. It's very difficult online to do that. And you cannot pepper the questions, which means you're not holding them to account for their learning. And you cannot test them, because normally you're testing them and you know what's in front of them. They are on their phones, and this isn't necessarily with, that'll be our kids, it'll be kids all over the place, where the children are on their phones in a WhatsApp group where they're texting each other constantly throughout the lesson, either just making silly jokes or giving each other the answers and supporting each other in that way. But actually, it means that the knowledge isn't inside the child's head. So what we found that when they came back is that, I don't know, I'd say for an online lesson, they probably manage about 20% of what they would normally have accessed. So in terms of the actual lesson, the teacher cannot give as much content. They just can't, because of the awkwardness of being online, muting, unmuting, getting on, etc. The minutes just aren't the same. So a minute is like half a minute. And so you end up able to teach about 50% of what you would teach in a normal lesson. But of that 50%, they're really only remembering maybe a third or so of that 50%. So you're really reducing in terms of how effective online learning is. And I understand we don't have any choice about that at the moment, and that's fine. Except I do think we are lying to ourselves when we think the children are being taught properly. It's nobody's fault. It's not the teacher's fault. It's not the school's fault. It's not the kid's fault. It's not the parents' fault. It's nobody's fault. But we do need to recognize that our children are falling further and further behind. And those children who are very well supported at home, where their parents are able to do more for them, can get them reading, can get them doing extra maths on an online system, which has nothing to do with a teacher, but they're just working through maths. Those children are going to be in a far better position at the end of the pandemic than the children who just aren't able to access that.
Well, indeed, the reality of that is shocking to anyone who's not teaching and not seeing this. It shows the challenge we're at. If you were Gavin Williamson, how would you deal with this crisis?
Well, this is the thing. I don't think there's anything anyone can do. If it's the case that we feel we shouldn't have children in schools, then this is all we can do. The government have done what they can. They've given out laptops. I mean, obviously, it has been somewhat disastrous in terms of how they've rolled it out, and there have been various mistakes along the way. But where we are right now is the children are at home, the schools are doing online learning. And in the end, well, the only thing we can do is get kids back into school, really. That's all we can do. And until that decision is made by the scientists and by the politicians, our kids will continue to fall behind.
And to make that happen, it's surely vaccinate teachers, get them into one of the top 4 groups?
So that's a good point. So I am very pro vaccinating teachers, because I do think it needs to be a priority of ours to get the schools open and to get kids back into school.
And indeed, to plan further, I mean, there's a 2-week notice period you might get before the schools are open. Do you think we need to see, well, goodness, just exam years and young children in secondary schools back after half term? Or would you be more adventurous than that?
I mean, I'm really worried. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to be back after half term. I'm imagining it won't happen till Easter, to be honest. I mean, who knows? The only way we can make this work is to get kids back into schools as normal. And I suppose, as you just said, the vaccine is really the only way. And that means we need to vaccinate teachers. And I mean, I have to say, I'm not particularly keen on having this vaccine. I don't want it. But so it's not that I'm saying, oh my goodness, I'm more important than other people. I want the kids back in school.
Yeah.
If that means getting a vaccine, well, I'll take the vaccine. I'll do whatever I have to. India has actually said that they're just writing the whole year off. And all of the kids in India are going to redo the year. And I actually think we are arriving at that point in this country. And it's something we should consider, that all children should redo the year. So it's really bad for obviously the kids up at A level and at GCSE level. And that's not just the exam groups this year. It's the exam groups last year. So our current year 12s, who never did their GCSEs last year, have suffered. And now they're suffering again for their A levels. The current year 13, the exam group, year 13, are obviously suffering, and then suffered last year. Then there's the current year 10 and year 11. So you've got 4 year groups there who are in a dire situation. Then you've got the same thing happening round about year 6. So the current year 7s never got prepared for their SATs, so they're in trouble. Then you've got the current year 6s who are also in trouble. So you've got 2 more year groups there. Then you go back down to, reception age, where children are learning how to read. And those are the ones that really concerns me. Those kids, you've got reception, you've got year 1. So the kids in year 1 who never really did their reception year properly, they are also behind. And the other thing that people need to remember, there have been studies that have been done that kids, they miss 3 months, but they actually regress by much more than that. Comparative Judgment, this organization that does testing across the country of kids, they did a whole bunch of these year 7s. They do them when they're in year 5, and then they did them in year 7. And they decided that, in fact, the children had lost, over the last lockdown, they had regressed by 22 months. Now, that seems crazy. How could they have regressed 22 months? They've only been out of school for 6 months. But actually, that's what they found. And so missing those key moments of push towards an exam, which is, not exams so much, but for the 5-year-olds, but the reception in year 1 where they're learning how to read, these are key moments in your education. The year 6 and year 7s, and then you've got the final bit. You've got a number of year groups there that are really suffering. And I do think that there is an argument just to redo the year.
Are you sympathetic to Gavin Williamson at all? I mean, he's trying to deal with the crisis in real time, keeping schools open, doing his best. I know that it's hard for you guys at the other end, but he's trying to keep schools going, isn't he?
Yes, I do have sympathy for Gavin Williamson. I was very annoyed with the Conservatives over December and January when they it was crazy. On Monday, they had everybody come back. And then on Tuesday, they closed the schools, and it made absolutely no sense. And Piers Morgan has a real go constantly at Gavin Williamson and says that he's a complete idiot. And actually, I don't think that's the case. I think that there is a lack of communication going on in government. And from my perspective, I think it's just obvious that Gavin Williamson isn't told what's going on. So on Monday, he didn't know that they wanted to close the schools on Tuesday. So he told everybody they needed to go back. And then on Tuesday, he gets told, oh, gosh, change a plan. So I think there's a real lack of communication going on in government, and that leadership is the issue. Gavin Williamson, I feel a bit sorry for him because he's just getting it in the neck, left, right, and center, because he's the guy in the middle, and nobody obviously tells him what on earth's going on. I think it's obvious. I mean, otherwise he's completely stupid. I mean, the only other explanation is that he really is utterly stupid, and I just don't believe that. So I was much more understanding of government at the beginning of the pandemic because it was new and they were trying to find their feet. I'm becoming far less sympathetic now because I think they've been dealing with this for some time and they ought to have some plans. And, I just wish they were better at it. Having said that, I was looking at some graphs and seeing how many vaccines we have delivered in comparison to the rest of the world. And it really is extraordinary. We are doing
7 million.
Yeah. And so the fact that they've managed that, I sort of think, well, they've messed us around in schools, but the vaccines, that they're pushing out, which ultimately we imagine is going to be the thing that's going to save us. Well, actually, they're doing a pretty good job. So maybe they'll save themselves, with the vaccine, in my mind, because I have to say a month ago, I was thinking I had had enough of them and never wanted to see any of them ever again.
Well, Katharine Birbalsingh, the headmistress of Michaela Community School in Wembley, North London, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics, and best of luck from all our listeners to you to keep going.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right, stay with us. In just one moment, we'll be discussing another possible exit, Scottish independence, maybe called Skexit. We need a better word, don't we, listeners? Please email me if you have an idea. Anyway, more on that right after this.
Motherhood. It's a seriously full-on job. Late nights, early mornings, a difficult client. Hi, I'm Claire Newell. I'm the investigations editor at The Telegraph. I've spent my career flying around the world investigating corruption. Last year, my latest adventure was having our baby boy. And as I started to emerge from all the sleep deprivation, I started to question, was I going to be able to continue my career while looking after our boy? To find out, I made a podcast called The Juggling Act. I'll be interviewing politicians, chief execs, celebs, to ask them how having a baby has affected their careers, their relationships, and their lives. Yes? Mama. To find the show, search for The Juggling Act from wherever you normally find your podcasts and click subscribe.
And we're back. Now this week, former Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown caused quite a stir by writing in The Telegraph that the UK faces becoming a failed state, in his words, without nationwide constitutional reforms. Mr. Brown said that the UK must urgently rediscover what holds it together and sort out what is driving it apart. after recent polling suggested rising support for Scottish independence. Something is certainly brewing up north. And Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, has been demanding that the UK must agree to another Scottish independence referendum if the SNP wins a majority in May's Holyrood elections. Well, someone who knows a lot about this subject is Gavin Esler, the former BBC Newsnight presenter, a former Scotsman journalist, currently the Chancellor of the University of Kent and a Scot himself. He's written a book called How Britain Ends, and it's subtitled English Nationalism and the Rebirth of Four Nations, which takes quite a hard look at Britain's next potential divorce with itself. Gavin Esler, former BBC Newsnight presenter, welcome to Choppers Politics.
It's very good to talk to you.
And I'm sorry we can't meet in person in the Red Lion pub like we normally would, but we're meeting remotely, and as a consummate broadcaster, you've got a perfect line for this podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Let's hope it stays that way. The perfect line.
It will. What a great book. It's called How Britain Ends, English Nationalism and the Rebirth of Four Nations. And I would heartily recommend this to anybody listening. But we're always talking about Scottish nationalism, about how that might mean the breakup of the Union. But you frame it around English nationalism. Now, why is that?
Because it's so undercovered. And in fact, it's quite interesting. So many of my English friends, I live in England, I love England. When I talk to them about it, they quite often say, well, we English aren't nationalistic. That's why we're better than the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh.
They never say better, surely.
That is a strong implication. But
now, okay, so is that your own bias there? Because they would never say that to you, would they?
No, but for example, Kate Fox, who's a great writer, in Watching the English, say English people are never given to patriotic boasting. And she's obviously never been to an England football match, that's all I would say. And being on the other side. More seriously, I just thought that there were a number of turning points for me, and one was the 2015 election.
Yeah.
In the 2015 election, 3.8 million, mostly English people, voted for UKIP and got one seat, Douglas Carswell, who then quit the party, so they got no seats. And I thought, this is really bad. You know, it's not just bad for those voters, it's bad for all of us. They would have got, in a PR system, they'd have got 80 seats. Mr. Farage, you know, I don't speak for him at all, but I do think it's quite unfair that someone who's had his impact on politics has not managed to get at least some representation for his party in the Westminster Parliament. So I started to look at not just what I know from Scotland is Scots feeling that they are, and we can debate it, but many do feel that the country is run by Westminster broadly for London and the home counties. Many people in Northern Ireland, particularly now actually because of Brexit and the customs border, whatever one calls it, in the Irish Sea, are pretty jaded. But I think many English people, and this came to the fore during the coronavirus crisis of the past year, in different areas, are saying, well, you know, we speak for Manchester, we speak for Birmingham, we speak for Liverpool, but we don't really have quite the voice that the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh have, because they've got devolved governments. So I started to look at that whole system and think, can we reinvent it? Because the Union of the United Kingdom, which began in 1603, was reinvented every 100 years since then, in 1707 and 1801 with the union with Ireland, 1922 when Ireland left. It's a century since we've had a real think about whether it means anything to be British anymore. And do these competing nationalisms, particularly English nationalism, because England is obviously the most important, the richest, the biggest population within the Union, particularly when many English people have the right, it seems to me, to feel that their voices aren't heard or aren't heard sufficiently in Westminster.
I was really struck by your points there. My former colleague, George Caravan, as yours at the Scotsman, and the language of the SNP on separatism is exactly like that of UKIP, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And that was remarkable because I was in Scotland a lot in 2014 and in 2015. And I covered the campaign, and I don't think we quite got what George Caravan, a former SNP MP, a writer, wrote along with me when I worked in the Scotsman. He's very clear that what he calls it a kind of confederal system was what was on offer to Scots then. But it's actually a kind of federalism. The idea was that Alex Salmond and the SNP would accept the Queen as head of state, the Bank of England, and would broadly accept that we're not going to tow England away from Scotland or anything like it. We share an island. We share friends. We intermarry. We speak the same language. We've got so much in common as well as trade culturally. And it struck me that there may be a way of building on that for all the parts of the United Kingdom, to try to see if there's a new kind of Britishness. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's worth exploring.
We'll come to the solution, which you get to towards the end of the book. But you talked about a profound complacency of those in leadership positions. And I think you're right, you know. I mean, you talk to Scottish Tories and they say, well, the PM calls himself Minister for the Union. They've got former Tory MP Luke Graham as a union advisor. There's a bit more happening this week. We hear about Gordon Brown talking to Michael Gove about this. But how else are they trying to even think about the union? I mean, it will just slip away, won't it?
Yes, and you're right to talk about Scottish Tories, because I know quite a few Scottish Conservatives. And I can't say who it is, but one said to me, when Boris Johnson says he's a one nation Conservative, what we hear up here is, yes, you're one nation Conservative and that nation is England. Now, that may or may not be fair. Again, we can debate it. But if Conservatives in Scotland, who are the strongest voice for the union, feel that it has not been helpful, Boris Johnson has not been helpful. And I noticed this week he's talking about, I read in The Sun yesterday, he's going to ramp up the idea of saving the union. Well, last time he did it, he went to Orkney, lovely place, talked to some fisher folk and looked at some crabs and came away. That does not save the union.
Well, that's a bit harsh. That's a PR visit. You know how these things work. I just wonder if you felt that Brexit, which you didn't like, may have bizarrely served to strengthen the union, because essentially, now we're out. Scotland can't get back in. It can get back in, but it'd be the back of the queue, to quote Barack Obama. You might find it quite hard to get back in, and surely, you know, the union of the UK, if it works well for Scotland, could be as good as the EU in one sense.
I disagree, actually. Just leaving aside whether Scotland would or would not get into the EU with any great ease, I think that's a very, very complicated question. You're right to raise it. But just in terms of, does Brexit strengthen the union? I think the short answer is no. And one of the reasons it doesn't do that is I was born in Glasgow, ended up going to school in Edinburgh. And when I went back to Scotland in the summer of 2019 for Edinburgh Book Festival, I caught up with a lot of my old friends, and many of them would be quite small C Conservatives, and some of them possibly big C Conservatives. We didn't talk about that. But what was interesting was most of them voted no to independence in 2014. But by 2019, all of them actually, all except one, said that they had changed their minds. And they changed their minds for a couple of reasons. One is that they thought the vow of more powers to Scotland was just false. And as one of them said to me, I believe I'm Scottish and I'm British and I'm European, and I've never had trouble juggling all three identities. But now people that I didn't vote for are taking away one level of my identity, which is the European identity, and I want to keep that. So if it's necessary to leave the United Kingdom, I'll be prepared to do it.
So is that the point then? You vote to leave the UK to join the EU. Is that the two-part issue for Scots nowadays?
I don't think it's quite as simple as that. 62% of Scottish people, in every one of the 32 electoral districts, there was a majority in favour of remaining. And the ones I've talked to, feel they've been taken out of the EU against their will. That's the definition of a democratic deficit. And they feel it's symptomatic of the way in which they've been ignored. And people in the north of England feel they're ignored in other ways. And people in Northern Ireland, many people in Northern Ireland, feel that they have also been rather done over by the kind of deal that's happened. So it's not, we're going to vote to get out of the UK to get into the EU. It is that the Brexit vote is symptomatic, as one put it. It's like a rerun of an old joke. An Englishman, a Scotsman, and an Irishman go into a pub. The Englishman wants to go home, so everybody has to leave. So it's that, I'm making fun of it, but it's that kind of sense of, do we really count within British democracy? And if British democracy doesn't catch up with that and figure out a better way for people all across the United Kingdom to relate to one another and relate to the centres of power, I think, to use Gordon Brown's phrase of the past week, we risk becoming a failed state.
Isn't the point here, though, it's about money, in a sense that the elephant that is England in this union is sending loads more money than it gives its own people in England to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And once those cases are made, and they're not made, but once they are made, maybe, in a proper PR campaign for the strength of the union, why the union matters, the fact that the union protects the borders of the UK, once you make those points, then maybe support for union might rise.
It might do, but those points were made about maintaining the union within the European Union, and it didn't go very well.
True.
True. I mean, as you rightly say, Christopher, many of the points made by Nigel Farage about leaving the EU are being made with a slight change of words about Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. And in a sense, as you know, nationalism, I say at the very end of the book, there's a lovely Scottish myth about the Kelpies, and they are quite often beautiful horses that you meet when you're on a remote walk somewhere in the glens of the north of Scotland. And they look lovely, and you think, I'll just jump on the back of one of these little ponies, this lovely horse, and it will take me home. And it suddenly turns into a shape-shifting monster. You get dragged to the bottom of the loch and you die. Now, nationalism is a bit like that. It's a really good thing until it stops being a really good thing, and it's something which you can perhaps ride the pony, and it's fantastic that we're all proud of where we come from. But I'm suggesting that many of us ceasing to say that we're proud of being British, where we used to be, and I think there's lots of surveys that say that, as you know.
What happens next, Gavin Esler? Do you think there'll be a vote in May? The SNP will win, 2/3 upwards of the seats in the Scottish Parliament, and then what? Do you think they will push for this poll themselves, which won't be recognised by Boris Johnson? Will become a court battle going into next year?
I think all that is possible. I mean, I have to say that George Osborne, writing in the Evening Standard about 10 days ago, suggested that Boris Johnson could go down in history as the worst British Prime Minister ever, and he drew comparisons with Lord North, who lost the American colonies. And one of the reasons the American colonies were lost was partly incompetence, but also complacency. I mean, there are British people over there in America. They surely will want to stay well, that didn't go too well. So I'm not sure, and I certainly would agree with George Osborne, that Boris Johnson possibly isn't the best voice for the union in this country. He doesn't travel very well outside certain areas. And I think what will happen, I suspect what will happen, is he will dig his heels in. And one area I didn't agree with George Osborne on, he said the only way to prevent Scottish independence is not to let the Scots have a vote in it. Well, up to a point, but that's very difficult to sustain in a democracy. It's an argument of defeatism.
But that's what he'll do, because I mean, you can't have a civil war to give America its independence. You're not suggesting there might be a civil war here if Boris Johnson won't give the Scots a vote.
No, I'm not. But there was in Ireland, in the Home Rule for All Nations, as you know, the 19th century historian, was talked about for years and years and years. It came to the point, it was on the table, and then World War I broke out. And what happened? The Irish rebelled. I'm not suggesting any of this. I am absolutely not suggesting any of this. But what I am suggesting is that if you refuse to let people who feel they are a nation, and again, in a sense, that is an imagined community, but if you refuse to let people have their democratic say in a way that seems reasonably fair, you run into trouble. Now, what he could do, my suggestion would be that instead of simply saying no, 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 knowing that probably the SNP will do very well in May's elections, what he should do is actually come up with some suggestions, some possibilities that are credible and that don't fall into the trap of the vow in 2014, which overpromise and underdeliver and lead to even more irritation. So there are plenty of things that could happen. One of them would be, for instance, giving Scotland, and again, I don't speak for them, this may not be acceptable but to the SNP, but give them proper tax-raising powers. See if they can balance the budget in Edinburgh. And that would also end, perhaps, the grievance of this rather complicated formula called the Barnett formula, where we hand out money to different regions according to how we feel that their needs are. So there's all kinds of things that could happen. But to actually say, for example, to Edinburgh, why don't you take some more tax-raising powers? And by the way, raising taxes is kind of unpopular. I know you disagree with us, Edinburgh and Westminster. There have been disagreements about exactly how we handle coronavirus. Great. Well, you've shown that you want to go your own way on that. Here's some more powers. So there's all kinds of suggestions, which of course may not be acceptable to the SNP. But if you really are the leader of the United Kingdom, you have to start speaking like it, rather than just saying devolution was a disaster, which was a very, very silly thing for Boris Johnson to say.
Well, Gavin Esler, the author of How Britain Ends, English Nationalism and the Rebirth of Four Nations, thanks for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. It's a great book. I'll put a link to it in the show notes of this episode, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been good fun.
A fascinating chat with Gavin Esler there, and so many of you have got in touch asking that we do talk more about Scottish independence and the possibility of it. So please do let us know what you thought of the points Gavin raised on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast, and do email us if you can. We're chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk. Now, as a journalist, there are some stories that stay with you forever, and I'm sure everyone in my profession would say so of this pandemic. But another era-defining story is a rise and fall, and maybe rise again, let's see, of Donald Trump. And someone who spent the last 3.5 years with a front row seat following Donald Trump's every cop and spit is Ben Riley-Smith, the Telegraph's outgoing US editor. So 1 week on from Joe Biden's inauguration in the White House, I caught up with Ben to find out what he's learned from reporting on Trump's unconventional approach to running America. So Ben Riley-Smith, what was it like to cover Donald Trump as a journalist?
Well, pretty tiring, number one. I mean, the man is absolutely non-stop. You got a sense, people talk about his tweets being a defining part of him. As a journalist, you are kind of man-marking Donald Trump if you're in Washington covering that beat. And you could tell from his tweets when he was up and when he was asleep. And he would often be tweeting well before I was getting up in the morning. And then when you're going to sleep, if you have your phone near you after midnight, 1 a.m., you would suddenly see messages, tweets dropping in, because our phones were connected to his Twitter feed to let us know when he'd tweeted. So he was non-stop, not just in terms of his waking hours and how often he was making news, but also he is an arch media manipulator. I mean, here's a guy who built this brand around the business whiz, New York property mogul. We now know through New York Times reporting, some of that's not necessarily all as it seems, and then developed it into The Apprentice, where his business skills became kind of hardwired into the American conscience. So he's an immense, successful self-promoter, but he also understands media very well. The way he kind of gamed the system for the Republican primaries and didn't actually spend that much money despite being very rich, but he knew how to make headlines and how to get all the cable news networks looking at him. So throughout his presidency, you'd have these moments when he is deliberately trying to regain the narrative and reshape the narrative, which meant that it was an endless barrage of news, not to mention all the controversies that a lot of his actions and public statements triggered.
And for you as a journalist trying to cover this, I mean, we're 5 hours ahead of Washington. So when our newsroom wakes up at 10 a.m., it's 5 a.m. where you were living. You presumably started very early in the morning, and normally you'd be able to knock off work, let's say 4 o'clock. That's, a lot later over in the UK. But do you find you lost that downtime because Trump never switched off?
Well, I think certainly you get woken up early, and at points when big news breaks overnight, you can expect to get a call early from London that wants to get across the story and push it forward. One that in particular sticks out is the moment Donald Trump got coronavirus. I mean, so many staggering things happened in that election campaign. But just to remind everybody, this was 6 weeks before an election when the US president was struck down with a deadly virus that had no known cure. And, he is on the border of being clinically obese and is a man in his 70s. So he's in that concerned age range. And the way it came out was, of course, in a tweet. Donald Trump tweeted close to 1 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. We were asleep in bed. But of course, London picked that up, and then we got woken up at 3:40 a.m. because this huge news had broken. And that's not something that normally happens when you're in Britain covering the British coverage, because the day tends to ebb and flow roughly with office hours, daylight hours. But then the challenge for us was, once the paper went to bed, like you say, in kind of mid-afternoon our time, is actually you have a bit of freedom to try and meet sources, put in calls, try and gain a bit of insight and hopefully break your own stories. So yeah, it was pretty non-stop.
We know, of course, Donald Trump from the TV, but how close did you get to him?
Well, a lot of times I was in the room for his press conferences and his huddles with journalists. And it's kind of fascinating seeing him in the flesh, because a couple of things jump to your attention that you possibly don't on the TV. One of them is, and I don't want to be rude about or sizist, but he is a big man. He's 6'3", he's 17 stone. And that sheer kind of physicality in a room when he walks in, you never quite get on the cameras because he has very nicely cut suits and you see him from the front on. So he's a big guy and he just draws the attention and draws the eye. And I think that's one thing that really stands out when you are watching him on these press conferences. The other thing is he is just totally at ease in the spotlight. Now, a lot of politicians are quite at ease. But when you see Trump as a political performer, I mean, I've seen him on stages in front of conservative crowds going an hour plus, pretty much ad-libbing a speech as the cameras are on him and thousands of people are in the crowd. When he does reporter questions, he has this strange thing, which is it almost appears like he has no filter. Normally when you ask politicians a question, you'll know this, Chris, you've done it a lot, you can kind of see them processing the political angles of the answer and the trap you're trying to lay for them. Words will just start tumbling out when you ask him a question. And I think that's a candor that actually his supporters loved, because it did seem like he was that word that we hear a lot of in politics, authentic. It seemed like he was himself. He wasn't trying to come up with the focus group answer to various questions. He was just speaking off the cuff. And I think in a funny way, some of those skills are things that other politicians will try to emulate as they seek the 2024 nomination.
And did you find that you were more trusted by the White House because of the Telegraph and its political position, in the way that the BBC was seen as part of the liberal media elite, for example?
I think it helps a bit. I mean, with the BBC, there was a bit of conflict at the beginning between John Sopel, their top US person, and Donald Trump, who had a bit of a spat in one of the early press conferences. I mean, the challenge for reporters working for British outlets in Washington, D.C. is getting access. You know, political journalism is largely access journalism. You need politicians, cabinet ministers, advisors to pick up the phone to you. And politics is transactional. Usually a politician answers a call because they know that person's readers or viewers are also voters. So it's always hard for British outlets to convince US politicians that British newspapers with British readers are as significant as US ones. But there was an advantage in the Trump administration because this wasn't a usual administration. A lot of outsiders were now on the inside. A lot of people who didn't necessarily come from the DC establishment was in there. And so there were more ins you could create. And I think working for the Telegraph, which was a brand actually a lot of politicians in DC know about, did help opening some of those doors. Kellyanne Conway was a funny one, who was one of Mr. Trump's numerous campaign managers in the 2016 bid. After many months, really, with emails and phone calls going back and forth, we finally managed to have a chat with her. And I did that odd journalist trick that I'm sure you sometimes do in interviews, which is if you know you have some of the spicier questions, maybe you hold them towards the end of your chat, just in case they react badly, so you've at least got some conversation to write a story on. And I asked her about that quote that got a lot of play here early on when she talked about alternative facts.
So overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts? Alternative facts, 4 of the 5 facts he uttered. The one thing he got right was Zeke Miller. 4 of the 5 facts he uttered were just not true. Look, alternative facts are not facts. They're falsehoods.
And it happened after that press conference with Sean Spicer where he questioned the reports about the size of the inauguration crowd. And, you know, there was a lot of debate about how truthful the Trump administration was being in its early weeks in office. And she reacted very badly and said, I can't believe you're a journalist, yet you're going back in the past to drag things up. And I was slightly taken aback by the heated response.
Why not? It's a good question.
And I said, trying to cool it down, I wasn't trying to rile you, the question. She said, you couldn't rile me. You're sitting here in my White House office. We're in the West Wing in her office. You're here in my White House office and I'll be here until the day I don't want to be. And promptly afterwards, I was walked to the door and there was no handshake. So, yeah, that one ended quite frostily.
Well, good question there, Ben Riley-Smith, I think. I was out there for his inauguration in January 2017 and I bought this talking pen.
Greatest president that God ever created.
That's my Donald Trump talking pen, just playing to you, Ben.
I'm not sure if he was the greatest president ever created.
It's got the next one says,
Look, I'm really rich.
It goes on. I won't go all through 8 phrases from the talking pen. But do you think
had a lot of fun with that, Chris?
we're gonna. Is that the last we'll ever hear from the talking pen from Donald Trump, or do you think he might come back in 2024?
I think you'll certainly hear more from him, not just in talking pen form over the coming years, because...
Yeah, sorry, he's starting again. Carry on, yeah.
But will he be the greatest president in 2024 if he wins that election? I think the first question to that is this Senate trial about his impeachment that's playing out. Because if the senators convict him, they need 2/3 to convict, so a lot of Republican votes, they can then ban him from seeking public office. So if that happens, no, he's not going to be the president in January 2025. If they don't reach that bar and not enough Republicans rebel and he isn't banned from public office, then there's a question of, would he want to do it? I think that is a big question. I was talking to one of his friends a couple of weeks ago who said, listen, actually, post-presidential life is much more cushy than presidential life. You get a lot of the attention. You don't have any of the work demands. You can make a lot of money. You can continue to be in the spotlight with your own media shows. So maybe actually 3 years in, he's going to be late 70s. Does he really want to go through that again? And I think especially his narrative is false, but his narrative is, I won the first election and the second election was stolen from me, so I can retire a winner, which isn't true. But then if he entered the primaries, imagine if you come third in Iowa or fourth in New Hampshire.
Yes.
I mean, it can be humiliating for a past president to try and regain affirmation.
It's the embarrassing comeback by the heavyweight boxer, isn't it? And he gets or Bjorn Borg coming back with the wooden tennis rackets against the metal rackets.
Exactly. The comebacks are never quite as good, or the reunions of the great bands of the past. But I think even if he doesn't go for it, it is to a significant degree the Trump party and a huge proportion of the Republican voters who are going to pick the next presidential candidate do still look to him and do still hold what he says in regard. So he can be the kingmaker in some ways.
Ben Riley-Smith, our outgoing US editor, soon to be our UK political editor. We look forward to that greatly and have you back on the podcast. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
You can find a link to Ben's reporting in the show notes to this episode. And if you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get your first month subscription completely free of charge. And after that, pay just £2 a week, cheaper than takeaway coffee. Thanks to my guests this week, Katharine Birbalsingh, Gavin Esler, and of course Ben Riley-Smith. Thank you to my producers, Elliot Lampitt, Louisa Wells, and Theo Luludis. And thank you to you for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, tell your friends, your mother, your milkman. And please give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. That's what Jacko and Careful Squid, amazing names, by the way, have done this week. Jacko says, cracking podcast, very good at inviting people with varying views. And Careful Squid says that we are great value for money, so thank you both. Reviews like those two really help other people find this podcast. And don't forget, if you can, please always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, though, cheerio!